This is a Zeiss Ikon Contaflex IV. In this video I would like to demonstrate how I would repair this, and if you want to try this yourself, obviously you would do it on your own risk. First of all, there's many different models of the Contaflex, and the Contaflex III and IV, like this one, are very similar, but you cannot expect the other models to be to have the same parts and so on. They are quite different. To the state of this example, it has a built-in light meter. The light meter seems to work very well. I compared it to another working light meter, and the results are quite similar, taking into account that this is a selenium light meter, and those are in general not so precise. So what does not work on this camera? Well, I tried to use the slow times and they are stuck. So all times from 15 down to 1, they don't run down very smoothly. So this took almost 3 seconds for what was supposed to be 1/2 of a second. Also, the other times I measured the speeds with a device, and they seem to be too slow. For example, a 30th of a second seems to be actually 1/15 of a second, and all the other times are as well approximately factor 2 too slow. What else? The leaves of the shutter as well as the leaves of the aperture seem to be very clean. That is quite unusual. But nevertheless, I will clean everything if I do it anyways. So because of that's not very time consuming, and I can make sure that it will stay clean for a long time then. Also, the flash sync does not work at all. It simply doesn't fire. So I think that the contact somewhere is broken there. Apart from that, the viewfinder is working normally, but it looks very dusty. I'm pretty sure that there's a lot of dust on the ground glass from underneath the prism. And I definitely want to clean that. That's of course not completely necessary. It would work just fine if the shutter works. So in theory, if I just wanted to make this work again, I would only need to take the shutter apart and clean the escapement mechanisms to get the slow speeds again. But I like to make a full clean so that the speeds are also precise and I have a clean view through the viewfinder. Another thing that I always would test on this kind of camera is the speed of the aperture. That's because it has an automatic close down aperture, and the complete mechanism relies on the aperture to be fast enough. And if it isn't, the shutter simply fires, but the aperture hasn't closed down already. So you would basically take all the pictures with a wider aperture than you configured it. And that, of course, you really want to avoid. And to test that, it's quite simple. You put the speed of the shutter to 1/500th of a second, because it's the fastest speed, and set the aperture to f22 because it's the smallest aperture. Then you open the bag. And then you can see through the lens, wind the shutter and fire it. And when it works, like in this example, I don't know if it's visible on the camera, but you should see for a very short time that there's a light coming through only the size of the configured aperture f22. If it's wider than that, then the aperture is not fast enough. And I selected the fastest speed because if it works on the fastest speed, it works on all speeds. So yeah, that's a very common problem on those Contaflexes. It doesn't seem to be a problem on this particular example, but if that problem exists, you would certainly need to clean the aperture blades and all the mechanisms that are connected to that. It must be completely clean, and otherwise it wouldn't be fast enough. Another thing that should be tested is that the built-in safe timer also works. It is also sometimes a problem that when you first buy such a camera and you fire the shutter, but it does not open the shutter then again. And if that's the case, it's very likely that the self-timer didn't run down completely. Someone winded it before, but it got stuck. And if it didn't wind down from V to X or M, then the shutter is prevented from firing. To cock the self-timer on a Contaflex IV, it is required to push inside this little lever here. Otherwise it would be locked. And you can already see that it runs down. That's because the shutter is not cocked. On this particular model, it would be only stopped from running down when the shutter is cocked. And in this case also it seems to work, although not very smoothly, but quite okay. The focus also is very smooth. I checked the distances on the viewfinder, and just one thing which is not optimal is that when I focus on infinity, the focus setting is actually set to around 6 meters, so you can focus beyond infinity. The first thing I would do is take off the front lens element, put it apart. We will not need it right now. And then you can see the centered lens element with its tubular mount. And you can also see that there's on one side a particular pin, and I already removed this pin. It looks like this. It's important to put it back on the exact same location as it was before, because otherwise the lens is not centered well. This complete tubular mount can then be unscrewed, and this is only possible when you remove this pin before that. To remove this lens mount, you often need quite some force, and I recommend to use a ping pong ball with a self-cut piece of double-sided tape. This gives a very good grip, and it fits perfectly for the size of this lens mount. And then you would need to put the camera into your lap and push the ping pong ball down to the lens with a lot of force and turn it, and then you can unscrew it. And it was very simple for me now, because I already prepared for this video to remove this. And I would certainly always do this as long as the shutter is still connected to the camera body, because this way you have a very good grip on the camera body and also good grip on the ping pong ball, and then you can apply a good force. Once that's done, I want to leave the shutter as is for now and start with the top cover of the camera body. To remove the top plate of the camera body, there's 3 points that need to be loosened. The point of the viewing lens, then there's a screw underneath this cocking lever, and then there's a screw underneath the setting for the self-timer. And I always start by first taking off the viewing lens, because that's the hardest part to do. So this was just an accessory to mount a flash. Some do not have this and just have the black ring here. This can be put aside. To remove this lens element, you also need often quite some force. It's rather unusual that you can unscrew it just with your fingers. And I really do not recommend using something like this, because if you apply force like this, it is very likely that you destroy the circular shape of the lens and make it impossible to screw the black ring back inside. So instead I have a custom tool for this. It's made out of a piece of aluminium and it fits around, so I can grip it. Yeah, in this case it was very simple. This is the viewing lens. Also note that there's a small shim here. Then aside. Next, the cocking button. There's 3 screws that hold it in place, and they are on the sides. They're there and there. Okay, here comes apart the frame counter disc and the entire cocking button. I will clean them later when I assemble them back together. It's quite a lot of parts, and the final part is the spring. Then this part needs to be disassembled. Again, 3 screws. And there I can see the screw that holds the top cover plate. There's also 1 washer here. Sometimes it's 2. But I will put this thing back on here as soon as I remove the top plate. So I keep them in the reach. Next, this side, to remove the button of the exposure meter as well as the rewind knob, you need to remove the back. And I use a screwdriver and put it into this fork to hold it. And then I can simply unscrew the rewind knob. This reveals 2 holes to put in a lens spanner. Let me put the back to the camera so it stands better. And then there's also a lot of discs here. First of all, the DIN or ASA setting with a spring washer. And this piece. And the entire button. Put the entire parts away. I don't need them for some time now. Also, there's this part, and I take it off also. Now we can see the last screw that holds the cover plate. So I can continue in removing this. There it comes. So they used rubber foam to light seal the view to the needle of the exposure meter, and this is always very old and broken, and all the dry foam comes off and finds its way everywhere, and that's also a probably reason for the viewfinder being very dirty. Later I will replace the rubber foam with a new piece. Next I can put back the winding knob. I just do that for convenience, so it's easier for me to wind the shutter again. So now it should be completely possible to wind the shutter, and to release it I just push in this little pinion here. I almost forgot, keep an eye on two parts. First of all, this one, because it is very loose and is only held by the screw that also holds the top cover plate. And also on the other side we have this part. Sometimes it also has a washer underneath, but in this case it doesn't. And those two parts are to give the cover plate resting when it is screwed down. So, because they are very easily lost, I also put them securely away.